So, as we jump into talking about the politics of the Gilded Age, I thought it might be best to kind of start off with what the Gilded Age was. So, the term Gilded Age refers to the superficial glitter of the new wealth prominently displayed in the late 19th century. Historians criticize the politics of this era as being more show than substance. First off, we're talking about roughly the 20 years from 1876 to 1896. That is kind of the political era gap, whatever you want to call it, that we're talking about here. And when we talk about more show than substance, think of it like the Kardashians. Everyone knows who they are, but no one knows what they actually are famous for. They're definitely more show than substance. And the politicians of this era are kind of like that, especially the presidents. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. No president of this era served 2 consecutive terms. Only one president in this era served 2 terms at all, and that was Grover Cleveland, and his were separated by a loss in the middle. The politicians in this era ignored the problems that were arising from society as we grew as a country, both as an industrial country and with just people living in cities. And so the presidents of this era and the politicians in general just tended to ignore what was going on in society and tried to toe the line and be offensive, uncontroversial, whatever you want to call it, to hold their positions of power. Since they were all so concerned with holding their positions of power, a lot of people think that that this era is marked by complacency. The belief in limited government, laissez-faire politics that we've talked about before, laissez-faire economics, I should say, hands-off economics, tied in with social Darwinism, led to the idea of the do little government. So since politicians were so concerned with letting businesses be business, and then, survival of the fittest in society and in economics, it seemed as if they were doing almost nothing when it came to the politics. And it's kind of true. They really didn't do almost anything. The federal courts backed this up because they actually said the government had very little ability to regulate business at all. Every time they would pass a law, we talked about the Sherman Antitrust Act before, the federal courts limited the amount that the law could be enforced. And so the impact of these few laws was almost non-existent. The campaign strategies of this era were pretty much the same thing. They did everything they could to avoid taking positions because they were worried if they took positions, then they could alienate potential voters. Between 1876 and 1892, every single election, presidential election, was close. Democrats won 4 of the 5 popular votes, but only 2 electoral college victories. So that means that they only won 2 presidential elections. Both were Grover Cleveland. But they won 4 of the 5 popular votes. So that's kind of crazy to think about that. At the same time, in the House of Representatives, 8 of the 10 congressional elections in this same 20-year period, the Democrats controlled the House. So what you see is really split government almost every single election. You have a Republican president with a Democratic Congress. And so you can only imagine what kind of problems that could cause. So basically, at this time, in order to make sure that everybody got as many votes as possible and didn't alienate as many voters as possible, you saw the politicians kind of focus their goal on getting out the vote. What that means is getting your voting base to the polls to cast their ballot. So it's effective. During this time period, about 80% of eligible voters turned out to vote during the 20 years between 1876 and 1892. And to put this into perspective of how astronomically high that is in America, in 2016, our last presidential election, only 55.7% of eligible voters turned out to vote for either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. So think about that. In 1876, 1880, 1884, et cetera, at times when the presidents are almost all forgotten by history, you see voter turnout at what would now be astronomically record highs. Again, 55.7% of eligible voters in 2016 cast a ballot, which was down significantly from 2012 and 2008, but pretty much on par with where we have been over the last 30 or so years. So you can see that over, as about 100 years have passed, intensity of voters and the drive to get out to the polls has really diminished for whatever reason. Okay, so since we're talking about the politics of the Gilded Age, let's touch base with the two major political parties of the Gilded Age. And it's the same two major political parties that we still have today in the year 2020, the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republicans of this era are kind of a party in transition, if you want to think of it that way. On one hand, they are still the party that was anti-slavery, the party that freed the slaves, the party of Lincoln, the party of Grant. And so from that perspective, African Americans were still a large part of the Republican voting base during the Gilded Age, just like they were in the Reconstruction era. And the method they used to turn out the vote, to get people to go to the polls, especially in the North, was the method they've been using pretty much since the Civil War. Remember, we called it waving the bloody shirt. That's when you would try to keep the memory of the Civil War alive, reminding the people of the North of the death, of the casualties, of the loss of limbs, and of the economic struggle that was caused in their minds and in their opinion by the South, and by proxy of that, the Democratic Party, which is viewed as being the party of the South. But like I said, they're a party in transition. In the Gilded Age, the Republican Party becomes the party of the businessmen, of the wealthy, of the white-collar, upper-class factory owners, people like John Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, etc., etc. Also, they become the party of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, also referred to as WASPs. Okay, and so the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant are going to be, again, typically your upper class, your what we would maybe call old money as well as your new money. But the thing that they have in common is that they support temperance. Remember, temperance is the tempering or lessening of the consumption of alcohol. And in some cases, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants were in favor of complete and outright prohibition. And so they become, the Republican Party, the party that is anti-alcohol. Also, they become the party that is pro-business because of their ties to the businessmen, the white-collar workers, and the way that they tend to support the businesses in America during the Gilded Age is through high protective tariffs. And remember, protective tariffs, or tariffs in general, are going to be taxes on imports from foreign countries. And so the higher they are, that means the higher the tax rate on those imported goods, which is, again, the idea is it's going to protect American businesses. And we can debate whether or not that's an effective policy or not, but that's the policy that had been used since people like Henry Clay, and it's the policy that continues during this time period. The Democratic Party is a little bit different. They're the party of the South and of the cities. They could count reliably on winning the elections in the former Confederate states, but pretty much nowhere else. They couldn't really rely on winning anywhere else. Their northern support came only really in big cities, and their support there came mostly from immigrants. They were often, the Democratic Party, often supported by the Catholics, Lutherans, and Jewish communities. And the thing that these communities have in common is that they are against temperance. And so the Democratic Party becomes the anti-temperance or anti-prohibition party. They argued for states' rights and for limiting the power of the federal government, very much in the vein of the Democratic Republicans of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and James Monroe. Now, party patronage during the Gilded Age comes back in full force, just like it was there during Andrew Jackson's presidency. Remember, he called it the spoils system. To the victor go the spoils. Remember, at one point, Jackson said if there's a job that a Democrat's not qualified for, we should get rid of that job. And it comes back full force during the Gilded Age. And so, in an era where the parties are kind of ignoring what the people need and what the people want, they kind of focus on becoming winners. They want to win elections. When they win elections, and they want to hold their office, meaning win re-election after re-election after re-election. And if they can do those two things, then they can provide government jobs to party faithful, for the people that supported them, that helped fund their campaigns, that helped get them to that point. Senator Roscoe Conkling, a Republican, is kind of one of the most well-known politicians of this era. He was the leader of a faction within the Republican Party called the Stalwarts. And basically, he helped run the New York's Customs House, him and his stalwarts. They were one of the factions. Another faction was led by Senator James G. Blaine. That faction was called the Half-Breeds. And so on one hand, you have the stalwarts in Conklin, the New York, or the upper Midwest, if you will, or well, Mid-East, but the industrial North, I guess. On the other hand, you have the half-breeds, and you basically have a rivalry between these two factions where getting the patronage jobs becomes more important than the policy that the party has. And so the rivalry within the Republican Party is really kind of the first big rivalry since the radical Republicans and the conservative Republicans of the Civil War era. And then there are the people in the middle, the people who don't want to really take a side. And the people that don't really take the half-breed or the stalwart side are called mugwumps. And they're called this because they basically are sitting on the fence. And the phrase is their mug was on one side of the fence, meaning their face, and their wump was on the other side of the fence, meaning their butt. So basically they were lying across the fence, trying to play both sides, but not really trying to play the game necessarily. And so that's what the three factions we have: the half-breeds, led by Blaine, the stalwarts, led by Conklin, and then the mugwumps, the people whose mug or face was on one side of the aisle, and their wump or their butt was on the other side of the aisle.